The soda can hit the ground with a sharp metallic clatter, spraying sticky liquid across a pair of leather shoes. They were old, worn by years of service, yet polished so carefully they still caught the pale morning light. Those shoes belonged to Daniel Cole, a 42-year-old veteran who had once trudged through the dust and gunfire of Afghanistan. Now they stood planted at the steps of the tomb of the unknown soldier, a place he visited every single day, not for himself but for a promise he had made long ago to a man named Mark, the soldier he loved and lost, whose name was carved into the cold granite only a few feet away. That morning, the air was clear, the kind that carried the faint scent of stone warmed by the sun. Tourists milled quietly, their voices softened out of respect. Then came the Graysons from California. Jonathan, the sharp-suited CEO who wore his authority like a badge. Lauren, his wife, all smiles for her phone's camera as she searched for the perfect shot to post online. And their son, Tyler, 13 years old, wrapped in the arrogance of wealth. His sneakers were spotless, his phone gripped tight, ready to capture something he could share with his friends for quick laughs. Tyler's eyes narrowed as they fell on Daniel. To the boy, the uniform looked outdated, the stance overly serious. He smirked, tilting his head toward his parents. "Just an old man guarding some rocks," he said under his breath, though loud enough for Daniel to hear. Lauren barely noticed, too busy adjusting the brightness on her phone. Jonathan didn't bother to correct him. Then, in one sharp, thoughtless motion, Tyler lobbed the soda can over the low chain barrier, letting it burst open at Daniel's feet. The sound echoed in the stillness like a stone shattering glass. Heads turned, conversations stopped. The sacred silence of the memorial was broken. Daniel didn't move. Not at first. Years of discipline held him in place, his posture unshaken. But behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, his eyes had changed. They were no longer calm, no longer distant. There was a storm in them, a storm he had kept sealed away for too many years. This was not just about a can of soda. This was about a place built on sacrifice, about the names etched into the stone, including the one that meant more to him than any medal or ribbon. It was about the quiet promise he had made the day he learned Mark would never come home, that he would stand here, guarding this ground, so that no one would forget. Yet here was a boy who looked at it all and saw nothing. A boy who thought honor could be mocked, that the dead could be stepped over for the sake of a video clip. The sight of it pulled at something deep inside Daniel. He could almost hear Mark's voice in his mind, not in anger, but in that steady way he used to speak when things were at their worst. "Some people don't know yet, Dan, but they can learn." Daniel's jaw tightened. He would not raise his voice. He would not lecture in the middle of the courtyard, but he also would not let this moment pass without leaving a mark. Somewhere deep down, he knew this was about more than a boy's careless act. This was about a test for both of them. The crowd remained frozen in place, every pair of eyes shifting between the veteran and the boy who had crossed an unspoken line. Even the air felt heavier, as if the weight of 100 unmarked graves pressed down on the moment. And in that weight, something was about to shift. Because sometimes, disrespect is more than just a rude gesture, it is a doorway. A chance for someone to learn and to see what they have been blind to all along. And Daniel, whether Tyler liked it or not, was about to hold that door wide open. No one knew yet how far this would go, but the first step had already been taken, right there on the hot stone of the Memorial Plaza, with a burst of soda at the feet of a man who had already lost more than the boy could imagine. If you believe that even the smallest moment can change the course of someone's life, then stay with Heart Story for what comes next. Sometimes, the path to respect begins in the most unexpected ways. Daniel's hands remained at his sides, but the air between him and Tyler had shifted. The boy was still grinning, the kind of grin meant to provoke, a shallow victory, captured in the glow of a phone screen, ready to be uploaded before the moment was even over. The crowd had started murmuring now, unsure if they were about to witness a quiet reprimand or something far sharper. Tyler didn't stop. He stepped forward, past the chain meant to protect the sanctity of the space. the soles of his sneakers brushing the stone where visitors were never meant to tread. He raised his phone high, adjusting the angle for a selfie that would catch both his smirk and the unmoving veteran behind him. That was when Daniel moved. It wasn't fast or violent, but it was certain. In one measured motion, his hand reached out, took hold of the phone, and let it fall. The sharp crack of glass on stone rang out through the memorial, followed by the hush of every conversation dying at once. The device lay there, its bright screen fractured into a web of light. Somewhere in the crowd, another phone was already pointed in their direction, recording everything. Within minutes, that clip would find its way online under a hastily typed hashtag, #StadtMemorialKid. By the time the sun had begun its descent that evening, the internet would have already split into sides, those who condemned the boy's disrespect, and those who thought the veteran had gone too far. Uniformed security moved in quickly. Jonathan's voice was the first to rise, thick with indignation as he demanded they handle this like reasonable people, which in his mind meant signing a check to make it all go away. Lauren hovered nearby, still clutching her own phone, torn between embarrassment and the temptation to spin the incident into some sort of social media performance. They were led toward a private office within the grounds, the walls lined with photographs of soldiers whose names most visitors would never know. Behind a desk sat Colonel Margaret Hayes, a woman whose posture carried decades of service and whose eyes left no space for negotiation. She listened without interrupting as Jonathan offered his version of events, punctuating it with offers to cover any damages. When he finished, her answer was as steady as it was final. "This isn't about money," she said, her voice even but resolute. "This is about honor, and about teaching the weight of it to someone who doesn't yet understand." Tyler slouched in the chair, his eyes darting from the framed medals on the wall to the door as if already calculating how quickly he could leave. But he wasn't leaving. Not yet. The silence in the room was different now, heavier, deliberate. It was the kind that followed a decision that would not be undone. Outside, tourists still moved through the memorial grounds, pausing in front of engraved names, leaving flowers, lowering their voices without being told. Inside, a boy who thought the world was his stage was about to learn that some places and some sacrifices were beyond the reach of mockery. Discipline doesn't always arrive in the form of punishment. Sometimes it arrives as an invitation, a demand, really to see the world through someone else's eyes. Tyler didn't know it yet, but the days ahead would place him face to face with truths he'd never considered. The kind that could only be understood when you have stood in the shadow of names carved into stone and realized they belonged to people who had once been alive, laughing, breathing, and who no longer could. The meeting in Colonel Margaret Hayes' office ended not with a fine, not with a scolding, but with something entirely unexpected. Sitting quietly at the edge of the room had been Dr. Emily Carter, a civilian psychologist who often worked with veterans in youth outreach programs. She had been listening from the start, her expression unreadable, until she finally spoke. Her proposal was simple in words, but far from simple in meaning. Tyler would spend the next 4 weeks performing community service at the memorial. No special treatment, no shortcuts. He would clean, carry, sweep, and speak to the people who came here, not just the visitors, but the veterans themselves. Jonathan immediately pushed back. 4 weeks would ruin their summer trip, cost them prepaid bookings, disrupt his work schedule. Lauren echoed him, pointing out Tyler's sports commitments. But Colonel Hayes didn't flinch. "You can rearrange a vacation. You can't buy back respect once it's lost." The agreement was signed before the family left the building, the terms set in ink that would not be erased. The first morning of Tyler's service was heavy with resentment. He showed up late, dragging his feet, his hoodie pulled up against the early heat as if to shield himself from the place entirely. His tasks were simple, clearing away wilted flowers, collecting litter, wiping down benches, but he performed them without care, as though each movement was a statement of protest. The veterans on duty that day offered polite greetings he barely returned. Hours crawled by. Tyler's complaints filled the spaces where silence should have been. Pointless, he muttered while sweeping. Waste of time, he grumbled when asked to restock pamphlets for visitors. His parents didn't come to watch. Their absence was its own message. It was near the end of his third day that a change began. Though it wasn't yet visible on his face, Tyler was sent to deliver water to a shaded bench where an elderly woman sat alone, her back straight despite the years that had surely weighed on her. She introduced herself as Clara Thompson. Her voice carried the softness of age, but beneath it was the steel of someone who had seen more than most could bear. Clara spoke not about herself at first, but about others, young men who had gone overseas and never returned, some whose names she still recited in her mind each night. Only after a while did she reveal her own history. She had served as a nurse during the Second World War, stationed in makeshift hospitals where the walls shook from nearby shelling. She had watched boys barely older than Tyler die before they'd even had the chance to write a final letter home. Her gaze drifted to the rows of engraved names in the memorial's courtyard. Then she spoke of one soldier in particular, a young man named Mark. She described him as kind but quiet, someone who carried a private part of himself that the world of that time would never have accepted. He never spoke of it openly, but Clara saw the way his eyes softened when a certain fellow soldier walked into the tent. Mark never had the chance to tell him what he felt. A sudden mission, a battle that ended too soon, and he was gone. Tyler listened, his broom resting forgotten against his shoulder. He had heard the name Mark before, in passing from Daniel's lips when others weren't paying attention. Now it connected. Clara's Mark and Daniel's Mark were one and the same. The old nurse's voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of decades. She told him that service wasn't just about battles fought. It was about the parts of oneself people carried into those battles, their dreams, their fears, the love they were never free to speak aloud. Many, like Mark, never lived long enough to be truly known. As Tyler walked away, something in him had shifted, even if he wouldn't admit it yet. Work like this was more than sweeping floors or handing out maps. It was about tending to memory, to lives that had been cut short. It was about standing in the space between the living and the dead and choosing not to look away. Respect, Tyler was beginning to learn, wasn't owed to someone because of their age or uniform alone. It was owed because behind every name, behind every face, there was a story that could change you if you only stopped long enough to listen. The morning sun fell softly over the memorial courtyard, gilding the stone edges in pale gold. Tyler had been coming here long enough now to know the rhythm of the place, the slow arrival of visitors, the gentle murmur of conversations that always seemed to drift into silence as they approached the central monument, the quiet shuffle of volunteers moving in unison with the day's duties. He no longer arrived late. He no longer kept his hood pulled up. There was no muttering under his breath now, no exaggerated sighs. Instead, he moved with a quiet purpose, his hands brushing dust from the marble benches, his eyes scanning for visitors who might need guidance. Somewhere in the days that had passed since meeting Clara Thompson, the defiance in him had begun to dissolve. On a particularly still afternoon, Tyler found himself drawn to the far end of the memorial. There, apart from the slow trickle of tourists, stood Daniel. His back was straight, his gaze fixed on a single spot in the long row of engraved names. Tyler knew without needing to ask whose name it was, Mark. The air between them felt charged, not with confrontation this time, but with something quieter, heavier. Dr. Emily Carter happened to be there that day, overseeing a small group of volunteers. She noticed Tyler watching and stepped beside him. In a voice meant only for him, she told the story he had only heard in fragments until now. Daniel and Mark had met during their time in service, their connection growing in the rare moments between duty and danger. They had shared conversations in the dim light of base tents, glances across crowded mess halls, and a trust forged in places where survival was never guaranteed. But the military of that time allowed no room for love like theirs to exist in the open. To be discovered was to risk a career, a reputation, and even safety. So they kept it hidden. Every touch had to be disguised, every word carefully chosen. Yet despite the silence imposed on them, There had been a promise when the war was over. They would return home and build a life together. That promise was never fulfilled. Mark was killed in an ambush during a patrol. His body never recovered. His name had been placed among the unknown, and Daniel had carried the weight of that loss ever since. When Daniel returned, he sought a way to honor Mark without fanfare, without speeches. Becoming a volunteer guard at the memorial gave him that. Each day he stood watch was a way of being near him, a silent vigil that no one else could fully understand. Tyler listened without interrupting. The image of Daniel alone, steadfast and quietly guarding the memory of someone he loved, settled deep in his mind. It was a kind of devotion he had never seen before, the kind that asked for nothing in return, the kind that could withstand years without fading. From that day, Tyler's work changed. He no longer saw it as a punishment. When visitors dropped their wrappers, he picked them up without complaint. When an elderly veteran struggled to climb the steps, Tyler offered an arm. He started learning the history behind the memorial's design, the significance of its placement, the stories behind the dates etched in stone, and he began to notice something he had ignored before: the quiet presence of LGBTQ+ veterans whose stories had rarely been told, whose sacrifices had often been overlooked. He saw the subtle pins on their jackets, the way their eyes lingered on certain names, the unspoken bond that passed between them. Understanding grew in him like slow light. Respect wasn't just about rules or boundaries. It was about seeing the humanity in people whose lives were nothing like yours, yet whose sacrifices had allowed you the life you lived. By the time the week ended, Tyler no longer walked the grounds as an outsider serving a sentence. He moved as someone entrusted with a responsibility not to the stone alone, but to the lives and truths it represented. The final morning of Tyler's service arrived with the kind of crisp air that made the marble shine like it had been newly cut. He walked through the gates without hesitation, offering nods to the other volunteers, his steps carrying him instinctively toward the central courtyard. Daniel was already there, standing at his usual post. His uniform was as precise as ever, his shoes reflecting the pale sky above. Tyler approached with a quiet determination. This was the day he had promised himself he would speak. He stopped just a few steps away, waiting until Daniel turned to face him. The boy's voice was steadier than it had been in weeks past. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for that day, for not understanding." He didn't dress the words in excuses or jokes. They were plain, unadorned, and all the more honest for it. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You learned something here," he said. It wasn't a question, but Tyler still answered with a faint smile. That could have been the end of it, a quiet exchange before they both returned to their duties. But the day had one more turn waiting. The afternoon found Tyler in the storage building, clearing away items from the memorial's archives under the supervision of another volunteer. Most of it was ordinary boxes of pamphlets, tools, spare uniforms, but near the back, buried under a faded canvas, he spotted a small metal case. Inside was a weathered chain and a pair of tarnished military dog tags. The letters were faint, but readable: Mark A. Lewis. He froze. The name was unmistakable. Tyler asked the volunteer about them, and the older man explained that the tags had been given to the memorial years ago by a veteran who found them on foreign soil, but they had never been reunited with the soldier's family or anyone who might have known him. They had simply stayed here, waiting. Tyler knew exactly who they belonged to. When he stepped back into the courtyard, Daniel was alone, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind him. Tyler walked up slowly, holding out the tags with both hands. "I think these belong to you," he said. Daniel's gaze dropped to the metal in Tyler's palms. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface as though it were something impossibly fragile. The air between them thickened, and when Daniel finally looked up, there was a wetness in his eyes he didn't try to hide. "You didn't just learn respect," he said quietly. "You brought Mark back to me." The weight of that moment hung in the air. And Tyler understood, in a way he never had before, this place wasn't about stone or ceremony. It was about memory. It was about carrying forward the lives of those who couldn't speak for themselves anymore. Weeks ago, he had seen the memorial as nothing but a backdrop for a cheap laugh. Now, he saw it for what it truly was: a bridge between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknown, between the careless boy he had been and the person he was becoming. That night, Tyler began writing a blog post, not for school, not for his parents, but for himself. He told the story exactly as it had happened, sharing what it meant to stand in the shadow of sacrifice, to meet people like Daniel and Clara, and to realize the invisible threads that connect one life to another. He ended it with a plea to his readers to visit the places that hold history, to speak to the people who've lived it, and to remember those whose love and courage had been hidden for too long. Jonathan and Lauren read it, and for the first time, they didn't dismiss his words as childish. They saw the difference in him, and it unsettled them in the best way. Sometimes, a single careless act can open the door to change if you're willing to walk through it. And you, if you had been Tyler that day, standing with those dog tags in your hand, what would you have done? Follow Heart Stories for more true, human stories that stay with you long after they're told.